Yo ho ho! Welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I hope you're keeping well. So I'm going to be talking you through my top 10 horror novels that I read in 2024. And let me tell you, 2024 was an excellent year for horror for me personally. Not only was it the year that I read the most horror books ever, it was also just a great year for quality overall. And I'm super excited to share those with you today. Some of these books have even entered my top 10 favourites of all time horror novels. So I'm pretty stoked about that, and I'm really excited to let you know what they are, and hopefully you agree with me on it. Okay, if not, sure, whatever. I'm not going to take it personally. Starting with number 10, it's Goddess of Filth by V. Castro. This is a book I read quite early on last year. This is the first V. Castro book that I ever read, and I was really, really impressed by it. So I had seen a multitude of people reference this book, and it piqued my interest because one of my all-time favourite horror subgenres is, of course, possession, and this is heavy on the possession. So this follows a group of teenage girls, and they decide to hold a seance in the style of The Craft. Needless to say, it goes horribly wrong, as one of the girls is taken hold by something old and malevolent, and she starts talking in an ancient Aztec language and crawling across the floor. And over the next couple of weeks after the seance, not only does her mother ban her from seeing the other girls based on her behaviour, but her behaviour starts to get worse, and there's clearly something very wrong with her. And what I loved about this story is that, yes, it's heavy on the possession, and the possession scenes were awesome, but at its core, it's a story of girlhood, it's a story of friendship, and the powers that has in order to pull one back from the edge. And because of those things, this story had a weird sense of nostalgia for me. I don't know if it's because I was associating it with watching The Craft or associating it with friendships that I had in the past at that kind of age, and the things that you would go above and beyond for one of your friends when she wasn't doing well. There was just parts of it that I found to be incredibly relatable at times. I mean, not the whole kind of possession by an ancient being sort of thing, but the rest. Coming in at number 9 is Slewfoot by Brom. So it took me a really long time to realise that this is actually a novel and not an art book like I initially thought. So once I figured that out, I tracked myself down a copy and had to read it immediately. And this book did not disappoint. It was the perfect autumnal book. It really delivered on the spooky witchy vibe that I was hoping to read at some point last October. So this book follows Abatha, a young woman from a very Puritan village, and she is very much an outcast. She is often getting herself into trouble by speaking her mind. It's very much not appreciated by the men around her. And she is just her own unique character, and she refuses to be a modest, pious woman. And I immediately warmed to her because of that. She always speaks up for what is right. She always calls out behaviour that just doesn't sit well with her. And the fact that she's so often criticised for those two things, and the fact that, heaven forbid, her main sin was being born a woman in this time period. So ultimately her husband ends up passing away and she's left a widow, and the main story is that her brother-in-law is trying to get the house off of her because it's his land originally. He is such a cretin of a character. I can't even put into words how much I hated him. At times I wanted to throw the book across the room because he annoyed me so much. He was just the perfect villain, and I feel like I haven't read a villain quite like him in quite some time, someone you can really get behind hating. So all the while Abatha is grieving and going through the motions of having to deal with her situation, she's also dealing with something else that is lurking in the forest that's on the edge of her land. She believes that there's some sort of entity out there, and they end up crossing paths. And this entity refers to himself as Father, and he is as old as the woods. And the story takes this really cool, weird kind of pagan turn with the introduction of Father and his assortment of otherworldly type of beings. So if you're someone who's a fan of the film The Witch, or you just really like stories set around the witch trials, this is one that I really recommend you checking out. And it also has such incredible, beautiful artwork within it. Coming in at number 8, it definitely had to go to The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monika Kim. This is a story that I would say writing style, it leans a little bit more literary fiction than straight up horror, but the elements of horror that are in this are absolutely vile, they're disgusting, and most certainly will trigger your misophonia if you have any sort of issues around eating sounds. So this story follows our main character as she is living at home with her younger sister and her mother after her father has walked out on her mother. And unfortunately for her, her mother is one of those women who just feels that she needs another half to make her whole. And it's not until she meets this man called George that she's finally complete again. She finally has a reason to live again. And there's something really striking about George. It's not the fact that he seems to be just a stereotypical American man who's quite ignorant. He has a beautiful set of eyes, and this definitely comes into play later on in the story. I loved going into the story knowing that it's about an unhinged female character, and just the build up to the unhingedness was so slow, sure, but it was subtle. The delivery was so well done. The execution when it finally happened, not like the killing. I mean, well, yeah, whatever. The first kill was just absolutely delectable. I could not stop reading this. I was amazed by how gripped I was by the story. I procrastinated a little bit before picking it up because I had heard kind of mixed things about it, but to be honest, I really enjoyed it for what it was. Really went into it with no expectations. By the time I picked up The Eyes Are the Best Part, I was feeling quite jaded. I was feeling quite let down, and I had quite a sour taste in my mouth by a few recent releases that I had read. Maybe that is what kind of swung the whole experience for me, but I just absolutely loved this book, and the ending was so satisfying. Another aspect to this book that I really enjoyed is that I really loved the reference to American Psycho. It seems like it's really popular at the moment to reference American Psycho when you're writing a slasher horror book. Multiple books have done it. I feel like the book that paid the best homage to it was definitely The Eyes Are the Best Part. The scene really worked. It wasn't just like out of the blue. It wasn't just a reference for the sake of a reference. It made sense within the scene. It drove the story forward, and it really showed us what our main character was actually like. It was that eye-opening moment, pardon the pun. You realize like, oh wow, like we have fully blown, like jumped off into the deep end with this one, and there is no coming back from this. I loved the elements of paranoia that our main character experienced. And again, I found that kind of leaned into the Patrick Bateman type of unreliable narrator, where it's like, are they actually a psychopath, or are they just living vicariously in their head and having like maladaptive daydreams, thinking about killing people when they're actually not doing so? Yeah, this book just gave me so much food for thought. Again, sorry. And I can't recommend it enough, especially if you really enjoy slasher books, if you enjoy kind of slow burn books. Check it out. Coming in at number 7 is the first short story collection on this list, and it is The Trees Grew Because I Bled There by Eric LaRocca. So I only started reading Eric LaRocca's stories last year, and I am quickly on my way to reading all of his work. I absolutely love it. I love the variety that this particular short story collection had to offer. They're just so incredibly vast and so different from one another. It really gives you a good sense into Eric LaRocca's writing style and ability and imagination. And I think my favourite short story within this was definitely You're Not Supposed to Be Here. That's a story that I still think about, and it was just such a mindfuck of a story. Do you remember in the 90s when kidnapping stories were just like weirdly popular for quite some time, not just in books but also in films? We were getting a lot of thrillers with kids being kidnapped or people being kidnapped or whatever, and that's kind of like dipped off now. Like I feel like that's not like a popular subgenre within horror anymore. Like I said, I still think about it. I'm still like, wow, that is unsettling. The main themes within most of these stories are grief or obsession or kind of control. Again, they're very powerful themes and they're very well explored within these stories. The one negative thing that I'd have to say about this is that it wasn't long enough for me. I find when I sit down with one of Eric LaRocca's books, I will usually bash it out in one sitting, and sometimes I want a little bit more, you know? So yeah, I was glad at the time that I had another book on my shelf from him. and I pretty much read it directly after finishing this because I just can't get enough. Then at number 6, I had to put My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. This book was sitting on my bookshelf for a ridiculous amount of time before I ended up picking it up, and once I started reading it, and once I got invested into our main character Jade, I was really kicking myself that it was sitting on my shelf for so long and that I hadn't bothered or made the effort to pick it up sooner. Now, obviously it's a part of a trilogy and the final book in the trilogy came out last summer. I still have that to read. I'm kind of procrastinating on getting on with the rest of the series because I enjoyed this so much. I'm like, what if the other books aren't as good? This follows our main character Jade, and she is a teenage girl and she takes a little bit of getting used to. My first impression of her was I felt like a little bit embarrassed, a little bit, cringy from the fact that she's so obsessed with slashers and she has to regurgitate slasher film facts to just random people who don't even know what she's talking about. She always has to relate whatever conversation she's having back to slashers. And once I remembered that at one time I was this age too, and my hyperfixation was like punk rock or hardcore punk back in the day, and I always felt the need to bring that up in conversations and just prove how much knowledge I had on the topic to people, whether they wanted to know it or not. I was like, actually, do you know what? I like Jade. She's good people, She might be a little bit cringy and stuff, but we were all cringy at that age. We all felt like we had something to prove. So in that sense, I was able to make her relatable to myself. It just made for such a good story. So I went into this thinking I probably wasn't going to love it because I'm not a huge fan of slashers when it comes to horror. It's probably one of my least favorite subgenres. And because of that, I don't actually know all that much about the genre. So reading Jade talk about various different films, or like this is the first time somebody got their eyeballs gouged out or their throat slit on screen, I was like, okay. New factoid for myself. Thank you. I was getting a bit of an education while reading it too. And not only that, it was just a super fast-paced story that I, again, couldn't put down. I'm pretty sure I got through it within 2 days, and it's, a little chunkier than I'm used to. It was just such a fun, charming read. It had decent elements of horror within this. Like if you're going into this thinking you're going to get another version of The Only Good Indians, you're going to be really disappointed. But also I would say if you have read The Only Good Indians and you didn't really enjoy it because of the writing style, this is much easier to read and much easier to digest. Coming in at number 5 is my second and last Eric LaRocca book, which is Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke and Other Misfortunes. So this contains only 3 short stories in this collection, and they were all bangers. They were all absolutely fantastic. So this was my first introduction into Eric LaRocca's writing style. And, I was a little bit weary because anything that's super hyped up online these days, I just go into with a bit of weariness, a bit of distrust. This is one that really didn't disappoint. Again, the first story is probably the strongest story in the collection, which is the title story. And it is mostly told through a mixed media format. So you're mostly just reading through chat logs, which is why the book was so easy for me to fly through in one sitting. I'm not going to spoil it, but I love that type of thing. I love how gross that was. I love how weird and parasocial the story was, how obsessive yet again it was. I feel like the only other person who does obsession really well is Junji Ito. Honestly, I feel like Eric LaRocca is bringing such a fresh vibe to the horror genre, exploring certain stories that we have had in the past, but bringing a new twist to them. Yeah, I just, again, really love the variety and really just love the really disturbing imagery that he's able to convey within these stories. At number 4, we have my only success story from my extreme reading vlog that I did last year, which is They All Died Screaming by Kristopher Triana. This was featured in that video, and this is the only book that not only did I really enjoy, this is the book that became a new favourite for me. So to preface, this is an extreme horror novel. There is a lot of gross sexual situations revolving around food for the most part. They aren't super detailed. It is the kind of story that you really don't want to be having snacks while reading. So this story focuses on our main character, who's really a fairly unlikable guy. He doesn't have a lot going for him. He goes from shitty job to shitty job, and he really has no aspirations in life. And he is well known at his local dive bar, and while they're there, they're hearing reports as to what is happening up in Canada about this virus that has broken out that causes people to start screaming. And basically what happens to them is that they become screamers. They just scream and scream and scream until they can scream no more, because they're dead. It is a virus, so there is like a rage virus element to it where they will attack other people, they'll attack other screamers, and it's completely unknown as to how the virus actually spreads. So ultimately the virus finds its way down to America and all hell breaks loose. So our main character, Chuck, is forced into this unlikely, unwanted leadership role, and he is with a group of survivors. Despite the fact that the story has a very kind of minimal setting, we're only going through a few locations, it is absolutely chock full of action. All the characters in this story are detestable in their own unique ways, but the mix of them together makes for such a perfect, entertaining read. And I feel like there was an element of realness to how these characters were depicted, because everyone is irritated with each other. You really kind of get the feeling that this is an accurate display of how people really would be behaving. If you're looking for something that feels like it's somewhat of an entry level into the extreme horror genre, check this one out. Like, obviously trigger warnings galore, but it is a fantastic virus/apocalyptic tale. It really is disturbing while still being so funny and entertaining. Then coming in at number 3, I have Starve Acre by Andrew Michael Hurley. Again, this was my first time reading anything by this author, and I was on a really big folk horror kick over 2024. Which I'm still on in 2025. It's not coming to an end anytime soon. This was a really slow and subtle experience into a really weird, disturbing folk horror tale. So this follows a young couple who have lost their 5-year-old son, and both of them are experiencing grief in their own unique ways, completely separate from one another. And it's as if the two of them are ghosts who just occasionally cross one another's path. The husband feels like he's being more proficient about his grief. He is doing tasks around the house and on the farm, and the wife is really the one that he expresses concern for, despite the fact that he's completely in the throes of it himself. He's just not really dealing with it. This combination makes for such an incredibly heavy story, and I have to say the craftsmanship that went into telling it was absolutely exquisite. It's very difficult to tell a story like this, and to tell it in such a way that made it feel isolating, that made it feel suffocating. It was just incredibly well done. Again, you have a story at its core which is just about loss, but you have these weird folk horror elements to it that keep cropping up here and there that just kind of scratch your brain a little bit. You know, it just makes you question everything when these moments happen. The final paragraph within this book has to be one of the weirdest, most disturbing final paragraphs I've ever read in my entire life. And it was the type of book that once I finished it, I had to put it down and, you know, as they say, stare at the wall for half an hour, because it rocked me to my very core. It was weird in a way that I didn't know I needed in my life until I actually read it. But if you're someone who can build up the patience to reading such a slow burn as this novel, you should absolutely check it out, because it's weird. Then at number 2, I had to put The Fisherman by John Langan. So this is a book that again took me ages to finally pick up. It dealt with really heavy themes, and I just feel like I wasn't necessarily mentally prepared for reading it for such a long time, but I finally built up the courage, and man, was it worthwhile. So yet again, this is a story about loss, about grief. My barometer for grief has always been Stephen King's Pet Sematary. I'm a big fan, huge fan, which is why I'm wearing the shirt at the moment, which at this point now, this book has completely surpassed. I might as well just throw the shirt in the bin once I'm done filming this video. I'm joking. I love you, Stephen King. I love you so much. But I felt like this book really encapsulates what it's like to lose a loved one, specifically a partner. And it was really interesting to explore this emotion through the eyes of a man. So the story follows 2 men, Dan and Abe, and the 2 of them end up bonding over the fact that both of them have lost their wives. One of them having lost his wife a couple of years ago and is still trying to deal with the fallout of it. And the other not only lost his wife, but also his young child. So the two of them end up bonding at work, and one invites the other on a fishing trip because fishing has gotten him through the loss of his wife so far. It's given him something to do in his spare time. It's given him something to focus on. And by taking these fishing trips, the two of them are both able to be free of the houses that still reverberate very much with what they've lost. We learn about a place called Dutchman's Creek, which has a whole heap of folklore around it, about what you can summon there and what you can ultimately get back. They're told the story while sitting at a diner by another man who has history of understanding that fishing location and has very much warned them to stay away from Dutchman's Creek. And that makes way for the second story of this book, which takes place hundreds of years in the past. And honestly, if this whole book was just about the second story within this, I would have been so happy. It was so creepy and disturbing and genuinely scary at times. I could not put this book down yet again. That was the reason why I just had to keep turning the page after page and keep going, just one more chapter, and then I'll put it out. It all comes full circle with this story. I genuinely feel, as someone who reads a lot of grief-based horror novels, that this absolutely eclipses Pet Sematary. This story is very much in its own league. It is just an absolute masterclass when it comes to grief-based folk horror. And honestly, there's certain scenes within this that still play on my mind. I really hope that we get like a film adaptation of this one day. I think that would be incredibly interesting to watch. And yeah, I can't recommend this book enough. And finally, we are at number 1. And if you've already watched my best books of 2024, you're going to know what this is, because this is the only book that I rated 5 stars. And that book is The Ruins by Scott Smith. So again, a book that I had been meaning to read for years. I finally got a copy. I really wanted the American edition, and I'm so happy that I got it, because it's just, they're just a bit more comfortable than the old mass market paperbacks. This story follows 2 young American couples who have gone on vacation together to Mexico. And while they're there, they befriend many other people at the resort that they're at, including 2 German brothers. And one of the brothers decides to take off with a girl who's there on an archaeology trip. And once the brother doesn't come back after the allotted time that he's due to do so, his older brother ends up starting to get really concerned, and he enlists the help of the 2 American couples to go into the jungle and try to track his brother down. And it is a very difficult journey for them to make, because at a certain point they're kicked out of the car that they're getting a ride in because the driver refuses to drive any further. So then they decide that they have no other choice than go the rest of the journey on foot. And while they go on foot, they end up going through a village, and yet again they're met by locals who tell them not to go any further, that it's dangerous, and they will find nothing good there. And again, they ignore the warnings and proceed to go, and they find this old ruins where the brother is meant to be at. The locals surround the ruins, and the rest of them end up climbing up. They're trying to figure out what is going on, why they can't step off. There's so much upset and confusion within these scenes that it felt incredibly jarring for me, the reader, to try to make head or tail as to what was happening. But I really felt that Scott Smith conveyed like how these characters are feeling was how I was feeling reading this. And that was something that continued on throughout the rest of the novel. I think this book had such an incredibly unique villain within it. First, when this villain was introduced, I was kind of like, oh, come on, this is ridiculous. Like, what? Who thought this story up? And by the time I was finished reading it, I was like, oh my God, that was so genuinely terrifying. I'm not going to be able to sleep thinking about that. This book was able to convey such strong feelings of paranoia, of claustrophobia, of sheer anxiety. Found that every time I was going to bed and reading this, the first thing in the morning that I'd wake up thinking of is the story and where the story was going to go. It had such a strong prose that just immediately sucked you into it. I'm so happy that I read this. I'm so happy that this is now within my top 5 favorite horror novels of all time. And if you haven't read this and you want to read more survival horror, you need to get on it. That does it for my top 10 horror novels of 2024. Let me know your favorite horror reads over the year, whether they be new releases or old. If you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can always follow me on my Instagram and TikTok, where I make short form bookish content. And if you haven't done so already and like these types of videos and want to see more, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel and I greatly appreciate it. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this video and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.